All right, let's start part three here now, looking at planning of the battle here. And again, a fascinating contrast between the two plans and why the plan. And here is the uh, Soviet Marshal we're going to be talking about here, a really interesting guy, Marshal Rokossovsky. Roskovsky. I'm so bad with Russian names. You'd think I would have gotten better after all these years. All right. Um, uh, Rostovsky was mentored by Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky was the Soviet marshal who came up with the idea of uh, 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 deep battle and deep operation. He had bad experiences in the Russian Civil War, and he knew they had to do something different. So he sat down with others uh, and seriously studied um, and came up with this concept of deep operations, and it became the principal method that was used by the Soviets. He will use it. Rostkowski will use it here in Bagration to incredibly effective effect. Uh, Zhukov will actually use it in the invasion of Manchuria, the last battle of the war, and to a spectacular degree. And both Zhukov and Tukhachevsky, and Rokossovsky and Zhukov both learned this from Tukhachevsky, and we'll get to that in a little bit later. And this, um, the whole thing here is rapid, uh, deep exploration and penetration. This is a diagram that shows it very well. You're going to penetrate. You're going to actually have the infantry penetrate the lines, and then you're going to have the mechanized forces, the armor, motorized men, even cavalry, um, penetrate through there. But they're not just going to penetrate through, they're going to penetrate deeply. And the attempt is to penetrate into the enemy's reserves and the enemy's major headquarters forces back here and destroy them. So it's something that's fixation of Americans now of combined arms, but here the Soviets are doing it this early. So the combat arms and all of this is masterfully centrally controlled. So you have your first defensive belt, and they penetrate through that. Then they use the shock of what they're doing to keep going and not to pause at the second tier of defenses, but to penetrate all the way back in to the battle tier and cause tremendous confusion and disruption, and then they can go, they can drive in forward. And they have to marshal an enormous amount of forces to sustain that, both with the amount of forces you need um, to to flesh that all out and to sustain it as you drive in and get further. But once you punch through, it causes tremendous suffocation. And here this is the front line of the Soviets at the opening of Belarus. This is the city, their first objective they're going after. And these are almost hourly. I think that you can see the date here. Uh, that's the 24th of June. They start this on the 22nd, the celebration of Operation Barber. And then you can see how quickly, how in a matter of hours they're making deep penetration through the German forces. And then the date, this is just a couple of days in, they've reached their main objective. And what they're going to do is they're going to envelop huge, the Germans call them cauldron battles when the Germans do it with their blitzkrieg operations. And they're going to capture huge swaths of German soldiers and equipment here. as they drive forward. And so the penetration is going to be massive, and then they're going to continue on. So this is the map of the front of coming through, and you're going to see them penetrating and sweeping in and cutting off huge areas of German forces and capture them and disable them. And the Germans thought all the attack was going to come down here in Ukraine, and it all comes up here in Belarus and drives across. And here's the pre-pot marshes that we've mentioned so many times. And so they're going to drive right to the Vistula and the gates of Warsaw. Now, Eisenhower's strategy is very different. And now it's not that Americans are not keen on deep battle, deep operations. In some ways, we'll see that with the Battle of Kuwait, which we'll probably look at later in this series of talks. But Eisenhower has a very, very different thought on this, and his works very, very well at all. So here are the invasion forces coming ashore at Normandy, and his planning is to come in and do an incredible broad front. And we'll talk to the incredible educational program and the educational system in the U.S. military. And both Bradley and Eisenhower are very successful at Leavenworth, the Command and General Staff School out in Kansas. And they are going to teach them a very, very constant way. When Eisenhower is stationed in Panama, he benefits enormously from his commanding officer down there, Fox Connors, who talks to him and drills into him: never fight unless prepared, never fight without allies, never fight unless necessary. And Eisenhower takes all of these to light tremendously, because the Allies are massively prepared through Bolero and the marshaling of all the forces and the size of the Normandy and the Overlord invasion. And everything is done with allies. One of the things that Wigley in his assessment doesn't stress to the degree that it shows up in American military history is that America fights with allies. The allies are enormously important. We're going to do our next session is going to be on the Battle of Yorktown, and without the French allies, there would not have been a Battle of Yorktown. So we were incredibly benefited by that. What Eisenhower does here is really masterful. And here, what Montgomery wanted to do, Montgomery is always criticizing Eisenhower, and I think Montgomery's a jerk. And what he wanted to do was a narrow front. And Eisenhower's whole plan is that we massively outnumber the Germans, and if we attack them across a broad front like this, and part of this, remember, is the invasion of southern France, and this force is coming up here. So there's a broad front here. There's no way the Germans can mass enough forces to contend against all of it. With Montgomery's plan, yes, they could come in against it. And of course, he will come up and propose a bridge too far and drive in here with a single column. And of course, he screws it all up for multiple reasons, and his idea fails horribly. And of course, Eisenhower wins. And the other part of this is Eisenhower needs these allies. He needs Churchill, who's a very difficult person to get along with. Here's Eisenhower's Cross of Lorraine. De Gaulle is the leader of the Free French, and he wants them alongside us because they don't want to fight French forces, and they want them fighting with us. And he, of course, is Eisenhower with Montgomery, and he needs the French, the British, and the Canadians alongside him because it's tremendously important. And what Eisenhower is an absolute genius at doing is dealing with all these allies, and we'll talk to that a little bit later. Um, there were very, very few people that could have uh, accomplished what Eisenhower did in his ability to work with this very, very difficult set of personalities around him. He was masterful at it. Um, Marshall is the genius back in the States, George Marshall, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I don't think of the Joint Chiefs then. And he is the one that recognizes Eisenhower's leadership abilities and promotes him way ahead of other generals, and he was right, totally right in his selection. And so here you see them taken out in what they go through. The broad front and the logistics that comes in with it, and Tukhachevsky's concept of deep operation and operational shock. It's a high risk maneuver, but has tremendous rewards. And here you see the twin princes. Rokossovsky proposes the twin princes, and he's at a meeting of the Stavka with Stalin, and Stalin says, fundamentally, I don't like that idea. Go out and think again and come back with your new idea. And 3 times that goes on, and each time he comes back, Rokossovsky comes back and says, no, I want the double pincer maneuver, not a single pincer maneuver. Stalin finally says, okay, I agree. And that the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is we'll get to later on the Stalin's purge of the military, but in the purge of the military, Rokossovsky is arrested by the KGB, the Cheka, and he's imprisoned and he's tortured, loses his teeth, loses other body parts, and I think he's taken out for execution, and is brought back, so he survives. By the way, I haven't mentioned yet that he's Polish. He's actually born in Poland, and so he's distrusted by the Soviets because he's Polish, and he eventually is put in charge of the Polish army after the war, and he's distrusted by the Polish because he's, of course, seen as a Soviet, as a Russian. So he has a difficult path. And here you see the conservative nature of what Eisenhower is doing in the broad front. And this engages the Allies. It engages the Allies on an equal footing, which is incredibly important to Eisenhower and what he wants to accomplish. And it's only possible with the incredible wealth of the logistics train that the Americans have prepared and put in place in the organization that enables that to go forward. So 2 very, very different plans and different where they go in. Now, the other point comparing is artillery and close air support. And here again, it's fascinating on the differences between them. It's the same subject, artillery, but the way in which it's both is done is so very, very different and so telling as to the nature of the system. Now, what Americans, and this is so common to us, and we seem to think that it's, constant, but it really isn't. The American system is a precision support arm and suppression fire. So it's counter battery fire. It's predicated on forward observation posts being put forward and calling in the coordinates of where they want the fire. And then the fire is delivered to that, and it's on call and directed to precision. The Americans will develop a time on target technique that's actually being used right now. While I'm cutting this, Trump is invading, and not invading, but is attacking Iran. And that whole attack is predicated on the same concept of time on target, coordinating all the attacks to arrive at the same time. Some planes leaving from for heaven's sakes, from Missouri, I believe, and they're aiming. They're arriving simultaneous with planes taking off from carriers in the Indian Ocean, for heaven's sakes. And so the arrival of all these, and then the mobility of the forces to move those and to move them away, and then again the benefit of having tremendous logistics supplying all of those and keeping them going forward. And we'll talk about the Red Ball Express, but it's the quality of communication that there's radio communication between the forward observer and the artillery battery and the direction, and we'll talk about time on target in a minute. And we'll also talk about close air support and the radio coordination there. So tremendously important. And here's a diagram of time on target. And what this is basically showing you is that they can put a call in to different batteries, and the batteries can determine what their flight time of their shells are to land at the site where they're going. And the different batteries will time all of them to land at the same time. So what this does is, if you're attacking, say, a headquarters unit, you don't want a shell to land and then they get warning to run for cover. You want all the shells to land at the same time, so there's no time for the target forces to seek shelter before the successive blasts come in. Now, the Soviet is a totally different concept. They mass huge numbers of tubes, huge numbers of artillery, mortars, whatever it is that's being fired in tremendous concentrations. They literally have artillery divisions. I think they may even have artillery armies. So an enormous concentration of force. Most people know the Katyusha rocket, in some cases called Stalin organs. And here, these are rockets being mounted on here, not of particular accuracy, but of tremendous devastation, because when they land, they all land together, and it has a devastating impact on what goes on. But here's some numbers on this. 36,000 guns or mortars, 6 times the density that the Americans have, the Allies have. Now, the difference here is their goal is shock and disorganization. They want all this ordnances to land and absolutely drive the forces, opposing forces, deep underground so they can't defend themselves. But the difference is, well, let's go back to it. It's all centrally controlled. So the firing coordinates are made at a central headquarters, and they're ordered. So there's nothing like what the Allies have of forward air observers calling in individual actions, individual strikes. It's all centrally controlled and massed, consumed, and fired. Now, when we get to close air support and technical air support, and we'll talk about this again later, I think. Again, the thing incredibly important about this is all the radios. The Soviets don't have anywhere near the number of radios that the American forces have, nor do they have the quality of radios. So every forward observer has a radio that's in communication with the artillery position. And in this case, we're going to see that all the forward air controllers are going to have radios contacting the tactical Air Force players coming in. The other innovation that Rosada is going to make in here is that in the air tac supply, they're basically going to be pilots. So the pilot's going to be the forward air controllers, and the pilot is going to have a totally different understanding than an infantryman. The pilot knows what the ground looks like to a guy up in a plane. You know, a grunt on the ground just does not have that knowledge at all. And it makes a tremendous difference, but tremendous procedure. And one of the things I'll be stressing again and again and again is innovation and new ideas. And this guy, tactical air is looked down upon in the Air Force. And the Air Force is a wing of the Army at this point, of course. So the whole power is done to the Strategic Air Command, or the Strategic Bombing Force. And so Caseta takes charge of tactical air commands, and he changes what goes on with it. And as I said, the forward air observer, air controller is incredibly important. And he's going to come forward, and he's going to have direct control, and he's going to call this information in to his commanders. The Tactical Air Command is so effective, there are actually cases of German units surrendering to the Air Force. They're so frightened by what the Tactical Air is doing to their units, they literally surrendered to a Tactical Air Force because they didn't want them coming in and hitting them anymore, because the damage that they were doing to German forces were just beyond. And here you see some examples of them coming in and attacking, and we'll talk some more of that later. And here's a good example of what goes on. So in every tank going forward, there's a forward air observer. So here's a P-47 coming overhead, and that P-47 can say to the ground guy, hey, there's a tiger around the corner up ahead. Be worried, be leery of that, and I'll go take him out, but know what's coming your way, or it's wide open. And when Patton breaks out, he leaves his flank wide open. For one reason, he is so confident of the intelligence coming from Ultra. He knows the Germans aren't there, and he also has P-47s up in the air. Caseta puts a P-47 flight above a tank column all day long. Every hour of daylight, there is planes above these flights going forward. By the way, you see this fork-like device on the front of this tank? That is a great example also of American ingenuity. The hedgerows in Normandy were a tremendous bane. An enlisted man came up with the idea, why don't we just put a fork on it and drive into the hedgerows and plow them out of the way? And it took the idea forward. I think Bradley heard about it or someone, and they said, all right, let's do it. And they literally went to the beaches and pulled in the beach barriers that Rommel had built, and they built these, and that's what defeated the hedgerows. What's most important about that is not that an enlisted man came up with the idea, but rather that an officer listened to him. That is a very American experience, to have that go forward. So the Soviet class air support, again, is very, very different. They have some very, very good close air support aircraft, and they have very good knowledge of it. But again, to an enormous degree, it's centrally controlled. And that means when a flight goes out, it's given its orders as what it's to do, and it's often coordinated with the artillery as what the artillery is doing. And they're not going out the same way. They don't, in the early stages of the war, they don't even have radios in the aircraft, and it's only later that they get radios, and then often the radios are very, very poor quality. That's one of the things that Lend-Lease did very well for the Soviets, is they brought radios in for them to use. And here's a picture of the Stomachics, the Ilyushin II, in the air, supporting them. And one of the constants that is in Wigley's, and this he's absolutely true about, and it's true in all of the wars, not so much in the Revolutionary War, but in war after war after war, We're certainly seeing it play out in what's going on literally today in Iran. Victory through material superiority. The American industrial might of bringing in huge quantities. The Germans used to revel in the fact that they could knock down a Sherman tank very, very easily. The problem is when they knocked down a Sherman tank, they would be there the next day, and they couldn't understand how America kept replacing tank after tank after tank after tank. And that's what the logistics system enabled in the organization of the logistics system, and how masterful that was. All right, we're going to pause this one here again, and our next one is going to be another very unique American experience, and that is the 8th Air Force.